I'm going to take us just very, very quickly through some of the things that we might want to think about a little bit more in the longer term, perhaps. Certainly what we've got in those films are themes around young people's own understanding of what risk is, whether that's the same thing as our understanding of risk. We've got young people's understanding of what sex might be, whether that maybe is the same understanding of our own, what we think sex is, and I know that both Sue and Carleen are going to develop that a little bit further. So what I'm going to do is, rather than talk necessarily about the concept of risk with sex, I'm going to just introduce some ideas that we might want to take away with us to help think about the idea of risk, what risk is. And John Coleman here has edited a book that's looking at the relationship between risk, resilience, and adolescence. And what it does is encourage us to think about what are those risk factors out there? What is it in the environment that makes our behaviour more risky, perhaps? So perhaps if we are living in impoverished communities with very little access to any services, within familial contexts where violence and abuse is common, it is possible that those might be seen as risk factors that make us more vulnerable. We also have the idea of risky behaviour, the behaviour that we do that puts ourselves at risk. And I often think, we train young people to look left, look right, look left again before you walk across the road. Do we train young people at the similar age to start to think, if I pick this up on the internet or if I get this on my mobile phone, how do I deal with it? And we've got to shift to that exactly the same education with exactly the same principles. There are particular young people who are maybe more at risk than others. And there may be young people who actually pose a risk to others. Now, the relationship between all of these ideas of how risk is formulated is very important and is one that we might want to keep echoing through some of the thoughts today. I've mentioned this, not all young people will think of risk in the same way as adults might. Things that we might be afraid of, young people might think are fun. And walking around the embankment, seeing young people on their skateboards on the edge of a bit of metal like this kind of going along, and I think, oh my God, that is so risky. Do they think it's risky? No, they're just having fun. And so how we understand this and how we help young people to understand the real dangers around some of the violence and abuse that is attached to sex is important. There is a risk industry. I think we need to have a little bit of a critical edge here about where the idea of risk is coming from. It does support an enormous financial industry, academics included who write about it, publish on it, the installation of CCTV cameras and the whole industry around that and the employment that brings. We have to just have an edge of thinking, are we being promoted more and more by an industry out there to recognise risk and think about it? And the way that we respond by seeing those vulnerable young people as lacking the capacity to manage risk is a problem. We have to look at their strengths as well and the ways that they do. And also to be nervous. I know that Helen Coates-Brown has said this in different contexts, but as soon as we see a problem, we tend to write a policy or a procedure rather than actually engage with the relationships about that problem. So maybe we need to get more tuned into the fact that we can't rely on all our policies and procedures all the time. It's the enactment of those which is all about relationships and how we do that. I've mentioned that there are various other contexts of thinking about risk, not only of the individual, but within the family, within the community, and the environment. And there is a whole literature of seeing the risk factors as the lack of a so-called good family, the lack of a so-called high intelligence as the risk factors. And then on the other hand, a whole set of protective factors that are attached to the way you become resilient, which are about so-called good families, higher intelligence, more access to resources. And the relationship between those risk factors and resilience protective factors is very important for us to bear in mind. And I apologise if I'm rushing through, but we can talk some more about this hopefully through the day. And there is a question, I think, that comes up in my final slide of, is coping the same as being resilient? So there are a number of ways that young people might develop ways of coping. They might avoid a problem, or we might encourage them to cope by avoiding a problem. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily building up capacities to deal with that problem. They're just avoiding it. So when we think of risk, are we just avoiding risks, or are we actually getting in there and say, okay, what do we need to cope with these risks, to manage these risks, to be able to stop the risks getting to us and destroying us? Keeping a low profile, becoming detached or retaliating, getting in there and fighting back rather than engaging with it in a constructive way, or actually joining in. And all of these, it's argued in the literature, aren't actually resilience factors. They aren't things that make us stronger. They're just coping mechanisms. So I think maybe during today we might want to think, when we're talking about these things, are we talking about coping, which is important because we have to cope, or are we talking about actually building up internal resilience factors for ourselves so that we can manage these risks if they exist in the same way? I'm not going to say very much about this because it's going to come up more, but the main theme is that we do have legislation, we do have some policy. There is always improvements that we can make, but actually what we're afraid of is using the word sex, saying that sometimes it's very, very nice, but also saying sometimes it can be extremely damaging and dangerous. And having a proper conversation with young people about that, rather than resorting to a policy that says, or a piece of legislation that says, is, I think, one of the things that we've got to get much better at. We've got to get much better at talking. And until we get relationships and values and sex education into schools that allows young people to do that, we're going to be missing. The young person's perspective is very important, and we've heard from the young people in the film, but just an example in some research that I did, a young person with learning difficulties said that when they entered into a relationship with somebody who was abusing them, that was the first time they felt cared for. So that young person was experiencing care in a way that they hadn't experienced before. We have to listen to that. A young man who was being abused within this country, but had left a country where if he had stayed, he would have been dead. So the abuse was better than the situation where he would have been dead. And an angry young person, as I'm sure the foster carers here would be aware of, bringing a history and bringing that history into the foster care placement. And we have to listen to those histories and those examples. So I'm going to finish here by referring to Mike Steen, who's done a lot of work about young people leaving care. And he has a diamond. You can't see it, but there's actually little arrows here, which means that it goes up and down. But he says that there's, within our care population, those who are moving on, those who are in school, managing, coping perhaps, but getting their exams, they are moving on. We have a much larger middle part of the wide diamond of those young people who are just getting by. They are surviving, they're coping, they're managing. We have at the bottom of the diamond young people who are actually going under. And it's argued that in our care, support and analysis, we don't look enough at that bottom group, those who are going under and experiencing multiple placement breakdowns, extreme and not managing risk, and perhaps not having those resiliences. So I'm going to stop at that point. If anybody's interested, the slides are in your pack, and I'd be more than keen